They told you it all began in Eden, that Adam and Eve were the first, that the serpent was evil, that the tree was forbidden. But what if everything you thought you knew was only the surface of something far more ancient, something that predates the Bible itself? My friend, the truth behind this story has been buried for thousands of years, and it's finally time to uncover it. Before Genesis was written, before the earth gods were silenced, cultures across Mesopotamia, Canaan, and Babylon told eerily similar stories of gardens, sacred trees, serpents, and the creation of man from clay. These weren't coincidences. They were the DNA of mythology, passed from one civilization to another, until finally rebranded in a single divine narrative. Now, here's the catch. The story of Adam and Eve isn't just sacred, it's strategic. A masterful adaptation that hides layers of forgotten myth wrapped in monotheistic design. And if this kind of truth sparks your curiosity, if you feel drawn to explore what most never dare to question, then you're exactly who this channel was made for. Go ahead, subscribe now, and join a community that doesn't just believe, it thinks, because what you're about to hear isn't blasphemy. It's history, and once you connect these ancient dots, you'll never read the story of Eden the same way again. Have you ever stopped to wonder where the story of Adam and Eve actually came from? Not the version you heard in Sunday school, but the real origin, one buried under layers of forgotten history. Before Eden was Eden, there was Dilmun. Before the serpent spoke, ancient myths whispered. And before the creation of man as we know it, civilizations had already carved sacred trees into stone. Mesopotamia, Sumer, Babylon, Canaan, names that might sound distant, but they shaped everything. These cultures didn't just invent farming and writing, they crafted the very backbone of what would later become biblical mythology. The flood. It wasn't new. The creation of man from earth. Already ancient. It's as if the Bible took a cosmic pen and rewrote what was once shared across empires. And here's the twist no one talks about. The Genesis stories didn't just appear, they were curated, adapted, layered with local flavor and divine purpose. Imagine a remix of ancient tales, polished to fit a monotheistic world. That's why it feels familiar but also strangely bigger than it should. But wait, because what happens when we look at who rewrote these myths? Now let's talk about the ghostwriter behind some of the most influential words ever written, the known by scholars as the J-source. This mysterious author from the 10th century BCE had one goal: repackage ancient mythology to fit a rising monotheistic identity. Instead of many gods crafting mankind, now it was one. Instead of divine chaos, no divine order. But here's the genius part. The Yist didn't erase the old myths, he reshaped them. He took the creation of man, the serpent, and even sacred trees from polytheistic stories and wove them into a single, dramatic narrative. It's like a master chef blending ancient ingredients to create something bold and entirely new. You feel it in Eden, you hear it in Adam's name. It's all there. He gave God arms to plant gardens, a voice that walks through Eden, and hands that shape man from dust. That's not accidental. It's storytelling designed to humanize the divine, to bring heaven closer to earth. And yet, he left traces, whispers of older gods and earth deities, subtly hidden between the lines. This transformation was not just literary, was political. The Israelites were distinguishing themselves from surrounding cultures, crafting a national identity. And what better way than to give the world a story that says, "Our God, not yours, created everything." The Yist gave form to that vision, rewriting spiritual DNA for generations to come. Want an example of this rewriting in modern terms? Think about how Hollywood adapts old books. The Lord of the Rings wasn't told word for word, was reimagined for a new audience. That's what the Yist did. Except instead of elves and orcs, he worked with gods and gardens. And just like any great scriptwriter, he knew how to create tension. Eden wasn't just a paradise, it was a trap waiting to spring. The serpent, the rules, the forbidden knowledge, all placed perfectly to provoke thought and challenge obedience. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Long before the word Eden echoed through synagogues and churches, there was Dilmun, a radiant land of purity, untouched by death or disease, described in ancient Sumerian texts. Sounds familiar? That's because Eden might be its echo, a divine garden, a place of beginning, a paradise where gods walked among the living. The parallels aren't small details there, shockingly precise. Rivers flowing through the land, a sacred garden enclosed in perfection, and even divine caretakers watching over creation. These weren't just coincidences, they were cultural footprints. Eden wasn't invented from scratch, was built on top of Dilmun's blueprint. And it wasn't only the Sumerians. The Akkadians, the Assyrians, even the Babylonians had their versions of this sacred space. Some had rivers with actual names matching Genesis. Others told of divine councils debating over humans. When all these stories are lined up, Eden looks less like a first draft and more like a brilliant adaptation. Think of it like architecture. One civilization lays the foundation, another builds the walls, and another paints the frescoes. By the time the Yist describes Eden, he's standing on centuries of sacred mythological scaffolding. Every tree, every serpent, every whisper of temptation, it's all been told before, just in different accents. If you've ever visited an ancient city, you've seen this. Temples built atop older temples. Myths work the same way. Eden rests atop Dilmun like a cathedral over pagan stones. The creation of man walks in the same garden that once hosted gods and goddesses who governed earth, sky, and seed. And that's why the myth resonates so deeply. It wasn't just about Adam and Eve, it was about all of us, shaped by collective memory. But to truly understand what makes Eden divine, we need to look at what's growing inside. ETS, those sacred trees that held the power of life, death, and knowledge. Let's zoom in on one of the most iconic symbols from Eden, the sacred trees, not just background scenery. These trees were the central pillars of divine knowledge and eternal life. And guess what? They didn't debut in the book of Genesis. Sacred trees were spiritual landmarks in Mesopotamian and Canaanite mythology for centuries before Adam and Eve ever wandered beneath them. In Mesopotamian temples, carvings of stylized trees are found, guarded by hybrid creatures were more than decorative. They represented divine order, cosmic balance, fertility, and wisdom. These were not trees to climb, but symbols to revere. The tree of life, the tree of knowledge, these ideas were deeply rooted long before they bloomed in Eden. Canaanite myths introduced us to Asherah, the goddess often associated with sacred groves and fertility trees. She wasn't just a side character, she stood tall as a feminine embodiment of life-giving force. And in some traditions, her image was literally carved into wooden poles planted beside altars. Trees weren't props, they were portals. Think about how cultures today still revere trees. The Bodhi tree for Buddhists, the tree of tenor once worshipped by nomads. Even our family trees are metaphors rooted in something much older. What we see in Eden is a continuation of this universal symbol, streamlined and reframed for a monotheistic story. It's no accident that these trees stood at the center of Eden. They weren't just decoration, they were temptation. Knowledge and immortality weren't sins, they were power. And what happens when humans reach for divine power? That's the narrative pivot of every mythology. Mortals crossing lines drawn by gods, and waiting right beside that tree is a creature we all know. Silent, coiled, and far more ancient than most believe. The serpent. But before you label it, the villain, wait, because the origin of this figure leads us to an even older, serpentine tale. Now, here comes the character who stole the spotlight without saying much. The serpent. In Genesis, it's the cunning whisperer, the trickster, who pushes Eve toward the sacred tree. But serpent symbolism goes way deeper, twisting through Greek, Canaanite, and even Ugaritic mythology, long before the Bible gave it fangs. Take the Greek myth of the Hesperides. At the heart of their garden stood a tree with golden apples, gifts of divine knowledge and immortality. Guarding it, a giant serpent named Ladon. Sound familiar? A sacred garden, a magical tree, and a serpent that ensures no one steals what only the gods should possess. The echoes are loud, aren't they? But Ladon didn't slither in from nowhere. He's likely a descendant of Lotan, a sea serpent from Canaanite lore, or even the chaos beast Leviathan from Hebrew texts. These weren't snakes in a zoo, they were cosmic forces, chaos incarnate, guardians of limits humans weren't supposed to cross. What's fascinating is how the serpent often symbolizes both danger and wisdom. In some cultures, snakes represent healing, like the rod of Asclepius in medicine. In others, they symbolize deception. It's almost like ancient myth couldn't decide whether the serpent was a villain or a misunderstood genius. So when the Yist inserts a serpent into Eden, it's not an invention, it's a loaded symbol, a creature that speaks out of place, challenging divine order. It's not just tempting Eve, it's testing boundaries. That's what made it dangerous. Not its bite, but its ideas. And those ideas, those questions it raised sparked the fall of innocence. But before the fall, there was a creation. And not just any creation, but one molded from the very dirt beneath Eden's trees. The creation of man from clay. A theme older than the Bible itself. Picture this: a divine being kneeling beside the river, scooping up clay, shaping it with care, and breathing life into what would become us. That poetic moment in Genesis isn't unique, part of a much older, global tradition. In Mesopotamia, gods like Enki and Ninmah molded humans from clay mixed with divine blood. Life wasn't given lightly, was infused with sacred responsibility. In Babylonian texts, humans were created to serve the gods. In the myth of Atrahasis, the gods grow tired of labor and decide to fashion mankind from clay and the blood of a rebellious deity. Sounds familiar? It should. The creation of man from earth is a story that resonates far beyond Eden and carries a very specific message. Humans are born from conflict, burden, and purpose. Even the Greeks added their flavor. Prometheus, the defiant titan, sculpted humans from clay and gifted them fire divine knowledge. And what happened? He was punished for overstepping. Over and over, ancient myths tell us, when man is molded by divine hands, he also inherits divine consequences. Creation isn't just about life, it's about limits. There's something universally grounding in this imagery. Clay is humble. It cracks, it crumbles. Yet from it, civilizations rise. Want to feel that symbolism today? Visit a pottery studio. Mold something with your own hands. You'll understand instantly why clay became the symbol of human origin. It's fragile, yet full of potential. But let's not ignore the twist. This fragile being, shaped from earth, is given autonomy, a mind, a choice. And that choice will soon be tested in Eden, just like it was tested in the older myths, where disobedience often led to transformation. A fall, maybe, but sometimes a necessary one. And that fall, it doesn't come from nowhere. It begins with a whisper, a question, a bite. But before the bite, there's another story hidden in ancient Ugaritic texts: a garden, a snake, and a character named Adamu. Imagine stumbling across an ancient clay tablet and finding a name that sends chills down your spine. Adamu, not Adam. Adamu, found in Ugaritic texts from the ancient city of Ugaritl. Then the Bible itself. This figure appears in a sacred garden, surrounded by vines, divinity, and yes, a serpent. Coincidence? Not even close. These fragments describe a paradise where divine beings walk, and a serpent strikes unexpectedly, echoing the very tension of Eden. But here's the twist. Adamu doesn't just represent the first man, he's also a symbol of humanity, caught between obedience and curiosity. The same dilemma, written centuries before Genesis, but with an even more mystical tone. And it gets better. Some versions mention a sacred vineyard, a divine tree, and the serpent attacking from the shadows. If that doesn't raise your eyebrows, nothing will. The overlap is too specific to ignore. The story of Adam and Eve doesn't exist in an echo chamber of myths retold by different tongues across centuries. Think of it like music. A song passed down orally for generations, each singer adding a new verse, a new rhythm. The Hebrew Adamu is one version. The Ugaritic Adamu is another. But the melody, the garden, the temptation, the serpent, it plays on repeat, generation after generation. So when people ask, is the Bible original? The answer isn't simple. It's not about originality. It's about interpretation. Each culture shaped these narratives to reflect their values, their fears, their hopes. And the Hebrew version, it stripped away divine pluralism and recast the myth in the shadow of one God. But even that recasting couldn't erase the fingerprints of older gods. In fact, the next piece of the puzzle leads us directly to them, those ancient earth deities, whose echoes are still buried in the names of Adam, Eve, and the very soil beneath their feet. Let's look a little closer at the name. Adam. It's not just a poetic label for the first man. It comes from Adamah, the Hebrew word for earth, or soil. But here's the curveball. In older cultures, Adamah was a goddess, a divine figure, representing the fertile ground, the womb of the earth itself. So what happened when that feminine power was rewritten as a man? The Hebrew narrative didn't invent the idea of a being tied to the land. It neutralized it. Ancient goddess traditions were transformed, sometimes demoted into more palatable forms for a patriarchal worldview. What once was a nurturing Earth Mother became simply Earth, and Eve, she wasn't immune to the rewrite either. Her name, Hava in Hebrew, connects to the word for life, but that's not a biblical innovation either. Life-giving goddesses like Ninhursag, Asherah, and others ruled ancient pantheons, often paired with sacred trees, serpents, or fertility rituals. When Eve appears in Genesis, she carries the ghost of these deities wrapped in human skin. What's fascinating is that these mythic roles were often fluid. The earth gods weren't just masculine or feminine, they embodied both. They symbolized cycles, birth, growth, decay, and rebirth. That's why it matters when a story like Genesis isolates power into a single male deity. It's not just theology, it's a shift in worldview. Want to see how this echoes today? Look at how we speak of Mother Nature yet build systems that dominate the environment. The rewriting of myth has consequences shaping how we treat land, life, and each other. The Adam and Eve story, stripped of divine duality, mirrored the cultural dominance of one voice over many, but even in that rewritten version, something slips through: the presence of the serpent, the sacred garden, the tension between divine intent and human failure. And that failure, that bite opens a door to the next question: was this all part of the plan, or did the Creator lose control? Let's pause for a second and ask the uncomfortable question no one dares to raise. If God created Eden, the sacred trees, Adam and Eve, and even the serpent, was the fall really a surprise? The story, as told, feels like a setup, a perfect paradise, with one forbidden fruit and a cunning serpent slithering nearby. That's not an accident. That's tension by design. This opens up a deeply philosophical and often avoided idea: the limitations of the Creator. In ancient mythology, even the gods weren't all powerful. They struggled, made mistakes, faced opposition. In Genesis, God appears, all-knowing, yet surprised, disappointed. He walks through Eden calling for Adam like a parent who just found broken glass on the floor. And that's the brilliance of myth. It doesn't always offer answers, but it dares to ask the hardest questions. Why did the serpent exist? Why allow choice if failure was inevitable? These aren't flaws in the story, they're features, remnants of older myths where gods clashed, where order fought against chaos, and where creation was never tidy. In older Mesopotamian and Ugaritic tales, the divine world was messy. Gods like Enki, Marduk, and Baal wrestled with forces they couldn't fully control. Magic, rebellion, serpents, and monsters weren't accidents, they were necessary. The idea that power must confront chaos was embedded into the cosmos itself. Genesis took that framework and gave it a cleaner facade, but you can still see the cracks. The serpent wasn't banished at creation, it was there from the start. Just like in those older myths, where divine power was never absolute, and creation always carried the seed of collapse. The Eden story is less about a fall, and more about inevitability, and that inevitability: man choosing knowledge, woman giving life, serpent offering truth, sets off a chain reaction that reshapes the human story forever. But before we close this garden gate, we need to look at everything one more time, from above, because the conclusion ties it all together, and might just change how you see every sacred text from now on. So now that we've peeled back the layers, what are we really left with? Not just a story of Adam and Eve, or a talking serpent, or a garden in Eden. We're looking at a tapestry woven from Sumer, Babylon, Ugarit, Canaan, and Greece. A mosaic of mythology, adapted and reshaped to fit a new theological frame. One God, one man, one woman, but with the fingerprints of many gods still on the clay. This isn't about discrediting faith, it's about understanding roots. When you trace the sacred trees, the creation of man, the earth gods, and the serpent across time, you realize something powerful. These stories survive, not because they're perfect, but because they evolve. Each retelling adds meaning, each culture adds reflection, even the contradictions are invitations to think deeper. That's why mythology matters. It's not dead religion, it's living memory. Every time someone reads Genesis, they're not just reading scripture, they're participating in a conversation that began thousands of years ago. They're holding a mirror to ancient fears, desires, and questions we still haven't answered. Who are we? Why are we here? What lies beyond that garden wall? And maybe that's the secret. The power of the Eden story isn't in its originality, but in its resonance. It taps into something primal, our longing for paradise, our curiosity for the forbidden, our fear of consequences, and it reminds us, subtly, that truth doesn't always come from a single voice, but from a chorus echoing across centuries. Now, take a breath and think, what if Adam and Eve weren't the beginning, but a continuation? What if Eden wasn't the first garden, but one of many sacred spaces humans imagined to explain our place in the world? It doesn't take away the beauty of the myth, it expands it. It shows us that even in ancient texts, evolution was already happening, and as this door closes, another one opens. Because understanding these ancient connections isn't just about history, it's about power, identity, and the very roots of human thought. But we're not done yet, because how we begin a story often tells us everything about where we're really heading. So now that the veil has been lifted, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you tuck it away, pretend it was just interesting? Or will you start looking at every sacred story with new eyes? Because once you realize that the tale of Adam and Eve carries the fingerprints of countless ancient cultures, it's impossible to go back to the same old version. Think about it. If the myths we've inherited were built layer by layer, what other truths are hiding in plain sight? How many stories have we accepted without asking why? And what might change in your life if you started thinking like a seeker instead of just a believer? This isn't about rejecting your faith, it's about deepening it, about peeling back the layers, owning your curiosity, and having the courage to see beyond the obvious. So I ask you, what part of this story shocked you the most? What connection opened your mind in ways you didn't expect? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everything. Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if this journey into hidden origins stirred something inside you, then don't just leave. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the next truth we uncover might just shake the ground you're standing on.